In this video, I'm going to graph and interpret hypothetical data from a hypothetical replication of Hurd and Watson's 1999 article, Reducing Wandering by Persons with Dementia Using Differential Reinforcement. Follow along with me to analyze ETA's data, then graph and interpret one of the other residents' data on your own for this homework assignment. All right, so these data are based on the Hurd and Watson article about using differential reinforcement of other behavior to reduce wandering by patients with dementia. It's a short article. I've provided you a PDF copy of it and a link in the instructions on Canvas. I want to encourage you to actually read this article. It's very short and fairly accessible. And then make sure you understand the rationale, so why they did what they did, and then think about how their method maps on to Miltenberger's instructions about implementing differential reinforcement of other behavior, right? So according to Miltenberger, the first step is identifying the reinforcer for the problem behavior. How did they do that? How did they identify the reinforcer to use for the DRO procedure? That's pretty straightforward because whenever possible, you use the DRO for the, you use the reinforcer for the problem behavior as the reinforcer in the DRO procedure. So instead of reinforcing the presence of the behavior, you reinforce the absence of the behavior. Then you choose the initial DRO time interval, eliminate the reinforcer for the problem behavior and deliver the reinforcer for the absence of the problem behavior, resetting the interval anytime the problem behavior occurs. And then as the learner, the client, the patient contacts the contingency of receiving the reinforcer contingent on the absence of the behavior, you gradually increase the interval length. I don't know that they really did that. They certainly don't talk about it in their results section, but think about, at least for the rest of them, how did they accomplish each of those things? And then how did they report, graph, and interpret their results? Because that's the part that you are going to do for your hypothetical data. All right, this is the beginning of the results section, and this is where Hurd and Watson identified the putative reinforcer for each resident for their problem behavior. And it's not the same for each resident. And they also specified how they determined it, right? Through direct observations. The results section goes on to say when attention was provided to Anna contingent upon the absence of wandering decreased by 50 to 60%. So this is the percent change in percentage of intervals with wandering. To get it, Hurd and Watson compared the mean percentage of intervals with wandering during the first baseline to the change in maximum and minimum percentages from the first social attention or DRO phase. They only reported a range in percent in this kind of part of each sentence of the results section for Anna. And I'm not sure why, unless they thought that presenting Anna's data the same way they presented everyone else's made it seem kind of less effective or impressive, which should not be a factor when you are presenting your results. But regardless, I'm going to ask you to report your hypothetical data the way they reported data from their other participants. Anyway, in the first part of the next sentence, Hurd and Watson compare the two baseline phases and conclude that they are equivalent. So that's all that wandering returned to baseline levels when attention was contingent on wandering means. Hurd and Watson's final comparison for Anna is between the percentage of intervals with wandering in the second baseline phase and the percentage of intervals with wandering in the second attention or DRO phase. Right? So specifically, they reported the percent change in percentage of intervals with wandering from the second baseline to the second attention, which was the intervention or DRO phase. Now, to calculate that number, which is 65%, they took the difference between the main baseline percentage and the mean attention percentage, and then they divided that number by the mean baseline percentage and multiplied by 100. Here's what they reported for another participant, Claudia, and I'm going to go through how to calculate these numbers in a little bit more detail. Right? So here's the first part of Claudia's results. When access to sensory consequences, which was identified as the reinforcer for wandering for Claudia, when access to sensory consequences was provided contingent upon the absence of wandering, so this is the DRO part, Claudia's wandering decreased by approximately 75%. Now to get that 75%, they calculated a percent change, which would be the mean baseline percentage wandering. They took the mean of these data points here and subtracted the mean of the percentage of intervals with wandering over the, I think, 8 sessions of the first intervention phase, the first DRO phase. And then they took that difference and they divided it by the mean from the first baseline. So just a little bit of arithmetic. The second part of Claudia's results is this part where they say when sensory consequences were contingent on wandering, so this is the return to baseline, wandering increased to levels slightly lower than the first baseline phase. And the way they would calculate that is to take the difference between the first baseline phase and the second baseline phase, the mean of the second baseline phase, percentage of intervals with wandering, and then divide by the first baseline phase. In your homework, you can report this comparison qualitatively, like Hurd and Watson did. So slightly lower than first baseline levels is a qualitative comparison. Or you can report the number itself, report the percent change. I'm going to encourage you now to make a qualitative comparison if the results for your resident are clear. That is, the two baseline phases are either obviously the same or obviously different, no matter which direction they're different in. And to report the percent change if the difference is subtle. Right? The advantage of a quantitative comparison, actually reporting that percent change, is that it is objective. It's not subject to interpretation. But a disadvantage to that is that this is not the most important comparison in this study. And if you want your readers to focus on the most important comparison specifically, one way to do that is to limit the number of less important numbers you present. So they can know that, aha, I'm seeing a percent change here, so I must know that this is an important number, because they wouldn't bother to report the number if it wasn't really important. And then the final part of Claudia's results is this sentence, reapplication of DRO with sensory consequences. So that refers to the second DRO phase, reduced wandering by about 75%. And where the 75 comes from is this comparison of the mean of the percentage of intervals with wandering across the 7 sessions of the second baseline and the mean percentage of intervals with wandering in the second DRO or sensory consequences phase. So they just compared the means of those two phases and then divided by the mean in the second baseline, and again multiplied by 100 to get a percent. Okay, here's what we're going to do for the hypothetical data from ETA together now. And you're also going to do this for the data for your assigned resident on your own. First, calculate the mean percentage of intervals with wandering in each phase. So there are 4, everybody has 4 phases. Then use that information to calculate and report the percent change in percentage of intervals with wandering for the first DRO phase compared to the first baseline phase, the second baseline phase compared to the first baseline phase, and the second DRO phase compared to the second baseline phase. Then you're also going to graph percentage of intervals of wandering as a function of sessions. So here's my data for ETA. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more soon so you can see it a little bit better. But in column A, I've got the session. In column B, which phase. In column C, the percentage of intervals with wandering for eta. You don't have this in your version for column E, just a bunch of checkboxes. That's to make sure that I cover each of the things that I want to cover in this video. And then there's some information. So this is information about eta and her results. So the reinforcer for the problem behavior of wandering in Etta's case was identified as access to savory snacks. So that's a tangible reinforcer. And we, as the hypothetical researchers, determined that using access to, and we as the researchers for this hypothetical study determined that her wandering was maintained by being able to go and get savory snacks using direct assessment and an ABC log over 6 sessions. Yeah, I'm going to zoom in now so we can see it a little bit better. And that means that we decided that the reinforcer we were going to use in our differential reinforcement of other behavior was access to savory snacks. So in this case, phase A, anytime a row says A, that means it was a baseline session in which there was no attempt to withhold reinforcement for wandering, and Etta had access to savory snacks when she wandered. Any phase that's labeled B, any session that's labeled B is part of a DRO phase. So Etta was able to access snacks contingent on not wandering. Right? So during those DRO sessions, savory snacks were available to Etta as long as she did not wander away, but snacks were removed when she wandered and made available again contingently on not wandering. Okay. So a little bit of information about the data. The behavior therapist, who let's imagine is one of us, and at least one independent observer used a 30-second partial interval recording procedure, and each session lasted 30 minutes. All right, before we get into the calculations, I'm going to do something to sort of demarcate, make it a little bit easier for me to tell which sessions were baseline sessions and which sessions were DRO sessions. I'm going to leave the baseline sessions transparent, the cells, but I'm going to sort of fill in all of the session Bs, so all the DRO sessions. And to do that, I'm just selecting those cells. So in this case, sessions 8 through 14. And then I'm going to mouse over to the top here, and where it says fill color, I'm going to fill them in a light purple. You can use whatever color you want. Sessions 15 through 21 are all, that's the return to baseline, the second baseline phase, so I'm going to leave them unfilled. And then sessions 22 through 30 are the second DRO phase. So I'm also going to put the background for them light purple. Okay, the next thing I want to do is calculate the mean of the percentage of intervals with wandering from phase 1. So let's say, in my case this is true, those values are recorded in cells C2 through C8. So the formula that I'm going to type into my formula bar is equals average parentheses C2 colon C8 close parentheses. So here we go. I'm going to put that information in cell G20. So I'm going to mouse over to the formula bar, which is up here. You can see that I'm in cell G20. And I'm going to type equals, which tells Google Sheets that I'm inputting a formula rather than inputting text or just a straight up number. And I'm going to type average. And it doesn't care whether I use capital letters or not. And then open parentheses. And you can type the cells in. You can just write them in. Or you can click on the cells that you want that have the numbers that you want to calculate the average of. So I've got C2 through C8, and then close parentheses, and press enter. And now it wants to autocomplete. Those numbers are not going to be correct, so don't let it autocomplete. Instead, I'm just going to type equals. You can do this in the cell itself or in the formula bar. It should appear in the formula bar either way. Average, open parentheses, and now I want the mean for the mean percentage of intervals with wandering in that first intervention phase. So because I highlighted them purple, it makes it easy for me to find. So that's C9 colon C15, close parentheses. I'm just going to do the same thing for the next baseline. And the next DRO. So now I have my mean percentage of intervals with wandering in each phase. But I'm not done. What I actually want to be able to report is the percent change in percentage of intervals with wandering from one phase to the next, right? Specifically, the first phase to the first phase DRO compared with the first baseline phase. To calculate a percent reduction in percentage of intervals with wandering in the first DRO phase, which I have recorded in my cell G21 compared with the initial baseline, and I have that information in cell G20. This is the formula that I'm going to type into the formula bar. It equals 100 asterisk, which is just says multiply, and then open parentheses, G20 minus G21, close parentheses, divided by G20. All right, here I go. Typing equals 100 times, and I'm just doing that so that it gives me a number between 0 and 100 instead of a number between 0 and 1. And then the open parentheses, and this is where I'm getting the difference between the first baseline and the DRL phase. The first baseline is in G20. And I want to subtract the percentage of intervals with wandering in the first DRO phase. Now I could click on cell G21, but just to show you, I can also type G21 and it recognizes that that is a cell in my Google Sheet. And then I can close parentheses, divided by G20. And if I press enter, it's made that calculation. Now it wants to autofill. We don't want to autofill. So we've calculated the percent reduction in intervals with wandering from the initial baseline to the first intervention phase. And for ETA, there was about a 69.6% reduction in wandering. So that seems good, but because this is a research design, we want to be able to come to a conclusion about whether there's a functional relationship. We need to return to baseline. We need to remove the treatment and see if the behavior returns to the way it was before. Right? That's necessary in order to conclude that there's a functional relation between the DRO, the intervention, and the change in behavior that we observed, right? Just to confirm that it's not a coincidence or due to something else. So let's compare baseline 1 to baseline 2 in the same way. So just like I did when I compared baseline 1 to the first intervention phase, I'm going to do 100 multiplied by using the asterisk and then open parentheses. And now I'm going to compare baseline 2, I'm going to compare baseline 1 minus baseline 2, close parentheses, and divide by baseline 1. Okay, and you'll notice that I get a negative number here. This is because I'm calculating the percent reduction, and baseline 2, the baseline rate of wandering was actually a tiny bit higher in baseline 2 than it was in baseline 1 for ETA. So we have a negative 2% reduction, which is actually roughly a 2.4% increase in wandering. Okay, so we've calculated this, and now the last calculation we want to make is the percent reduction in percentage of intervals with wandering for the second DRO phase compared to the second baseline phase. So just like before, I'm going to type equals 100 times open parentheses. Now I want to compare my second baseline with my second DRO phase, close parentheses, then divided by the rate in the second baseline. Right, and so yet again, this time we've got a 69.9% reduction in wandering. Okay, so we've done our calculations. The next thing to do is make the graph. And in order to make the graph, I'm going to make a copy of these data. So I'm just selecting all of the data, including the headers. So cells A1 through C31, and then I'm copying them using Control-C to copy. Or you can also go up to the File menu or the Edit menu and copy. And then I'm going to paste them down below, a little bit lower, and you can see it's pasted my formatting with me. And now I don't want these exact data. I want to reorganize the data a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this label, percentage of intervals with wandering. That's my dependent variable, so that's going to be my y-axis label. And now I want to have one column with percentage of intervals with wandering from baseline, maybe abbreviate it BL, and another column with percentage of intervals of wandering in DRO sessions. And I'm going to label this DRO. Hurd and Watson specified the type of reinforcer because they had a figure with 4 different panels. So they were comparing 4 different clients or residents who they all had a DRO. So using the label DRO for them would not have been maybe as informative as specifying the reinforcer in that phase label. But in our case, since we're only going to look at one subject in our single subject graphs, we're not going to compare across multiple single subject graphs. I'm just going to label it DRO. Now, what I want to do is move all of the numbers from column C that are from baseline sessions into column B in this duplicate set of data so that I can make my graph. So I'm just going to select these 7 data points, cut them out of column C and paste them into column B. I don't want a bunch of letters, so for rows 43 through 49, sessions 8 through 14, I don't want to move my numbers, but I also don't want a bunch of letters in column B. So I'm just going to highlight them and delete them. Then for sessions 15 to 21, I'm going to select the numbers in column C. I'm going to cut them out of column C and paste them into column B. And then I'm going to delete the letters from column B for sessions 22 through 30 in rows 57 through 65. Okay, so far so good. We've reorganized the data for our single subject graph. Now we want to insert the chart. In order to do that, I'm going to highlight my labels that say session, BL for baseline, and DRO for the intervention, and then all the data. So in my case, this is A35 through C65, and I'm going to mouse over to the insert menu, and I'm going to insert a chart, and there it is. So now I've inserted my chart. The next step is to edit this chart within Google Sheets. So to do that, you need the chart editor. It pops up automatically when you create the chart, but in case you've moused over away from it the way I have, you can select the chart again, mouse over to these three dots, and then the menu that pops up when you select the three dots, the first option is Edit Chart. So there we are. So now I'm in the chart editor and I'm in the Setup tab. And the only change I'm going to make in the Setup tab is I'm going to treat labels as text. So I'm going to use column A, which is the column that has which session it is in it. And I'm going to treat the labels as text so that I can see all 30 sessions listed out. I'm going to change the aspect ratio, make my graph a little bit longer than it was before. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. And I'm done with the Setup tab. Now I'm going to mouse over to the Customize tab. I'm going to start with the bottom here and work my way up. So grid lines and ticks. The very bottom, I don't have either major ticks or minor ticks right now, and I do want major ticks. And once I select to have them, this is for the vertical axis, I can change the tick's position from across to outside, and I can change the tick length from auto. I like them a little bit shorter, so I'm going to change them to 6. I don't want minor ticks. I also don't want to see the major grid lines, so I'm going to deselect that option. And now I'm going to change which axis I'm working on. So by default, you start working on the vertical axis, but I also want to see major ticks for the horizontal axis. When I select that option, an axis shows up. I want the ticks to be outside, and I want the tick's length to be 6 pixels. All right. The next option from the bottom is the vertical axis. And the only change I'm going to make here is an optional change for you because you are only looking at one graph. You're only going to report one graph. But if you notice in Hurd and Watson's article, all 4 single subject graphs appear as multiple panels within a single figure. They're sort of nicely aligned and directly comparable. One thing that's important if you're going to compare across multiple panels of single subject graphs directly is that they have the same y-axis scale. And you may or may not be able to see on my screen, in Hurd and Watson's figure 1, all of the y-axis scales start at 0 and they go all the way up to 100. So you do not have to do this, but if you want to, you can set your minimum value to 0 and your maximum value to 100. I don't think we need to do anything with the horizontal axis, so we can mouse on up to the legend. There are a couple of different ways. What I want you to do is get rid of the legend. In this case, we don't need to see it. There are a couple of different ways you can do that. You can select the legend, and you know you've selected it because it ends up with a little blue rectangle around it, and then just delete it. So press the delete button. Or in this legend section of the Customize tab, under Position, the default is set to Auto, and you can just change it to None. All right, moving on up. Let's look at the series section of the Customize tab. And by default, any changes we make will apply to all series. So the changes that we want to make are we want the blue lines and the red lines to look the same, and we want to see the actual individual data points. So the way we make the blue lines and the red lines the same color is we change the line color from auto to black, and then we change the point size from none to something greater than none. All right, so now we have one data series that is 4 separate lines representing the 4 different phases, the 2 baselines and 2 DRO phases. All right, moving on up. When we look at the chart and axis titles, I think where it says title text, we don't want this BL and DRO here. We want that information to appear in the phase labels, but we don't want it in this part of the graph. So like before, you can select this so that it ends up with a blue rectangle around it and then press the delete button. Or the other thing you can do is just highlight the text where it says title text in the chart and axis titles section of the Customize tab and then delete it. And similarly, we've got a horizontal axis title. So we can select the horizontal axis title, and where it says title text, just highlight session and delete it. And that gets rid of the unnecessary chart title and the x-axis label that we don't want within Google Sheets, because we want to have a little bit more control over its position and the font size and all of those other good things. Okay, almost done with the Customize tab. Moving up to the top, the chart style section, the only change I'm going to make here is I'm going to eliminate the chart border. So where it says chart border color, I'm going to select that drop down and change it from this gray to none. Now when I import this into Google Slides, it won't have a gray border around it that might interfere with the text boxes that we might want to include. Okay, so I've edited the chart in Sheets, and now what I want to do is copy and paste this graph into Slides, where I'm going to add phase lines, axis labels, and phase labels. Now I'm going to mouse over to my Google Slides. And in slide 2, you can see in the speaker notes, the instructions are to create an ABA style graph using percentage of intervals of wandering as a function of session for your assigned resident, and then paste it on this slide. So I am going to select edit and then paste. It's going to give me the option of linking to the spreadsheet, which might be handy if you've got a graph that you're going to continuously update. Since our hypothetical experiment is over and our hypothetical data collection is done, I'm going to paste it unlinked. There we go. This is a little bit too big, I think. So I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller to give myself some space to put my axes and my phase lines and axis labels and all that other fun stuff. I'm going to make it a little bit off center. Horizontally, but centered vertically. So the first thing I want to do is add phase lines. And in order to do that, I'm going to mouse over to this line icon in the icon menu, or I can insert a line using the menu. So whether I do it from the text menu or the icon menu, I'm looking for a line. And my trick for making the line sort of parallel to the y-axis is to just kind of put my mouse over the y-axis. So there it goes. Now I've got the line that is the same length as the y-axis, so it's the length I want it to be. it's straight up and down, which is what I want. I'm going to change it from gray to black, but if you don't want to do that, that's fine. And now what I'm going to do is use the arrows to move this line so that it is halfway between the last session of the first baseline and the first session of the first DRO intervention. So that's halfway between session 7 and 8. And zooming in might help me get a little bit more precise or not. So there we go. It doesn't have to be super precise for our class. If you are publishing this in a journal, you might want it to be precise, but that's good enough for me. Now what I want to do is add 3 more phase lines. So I'm just going to copy this. You can either use the insert menu or the edit menu and select edit and then copy and then edit and paste. And notice it's not vertically where I want it to be. I'm not going to worry about where it is vertically. I'm just going to move it so that it is in between the last DRO session, the last session of the first DRO phase and the first session of the second baseline phase. There we go. Now I want one more phased line. And I want that one to go halfway between the last session of the return to baseline and the first session of the second DRO phase. There we go. Sometimes zooming in helps you get a little bit more precise. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now my 3 phase lines are where I want them to be horizontally. So on the horizontal axis, but they're not lined up vertically. So in order to line them up vertically, I'm going to select all 3 of them. And the way I do that is I select the first one by clicking on it, and I can tell that it's selected because it's turned blue. Now I'm going to hold down the Control key and click on the second one. And while I'm still holding down the Control key, I click on the third one. So now I've selected all 3 of my phase lines. And now I want to line them up with the first one, because the first one is where I want it to be both horizontally and vertically. So to get the other 2 where I want them vertically, I'm going to mouse over to the Arrange tab of the text menu. And then the second option is Align. And I'm going to align them to the top. Now that's what I want my phase lines to look like. So here we go. I've added my phase lines in Google Sheets or in Google Slides. Next step is to add the axis labels. Okay, so this is why I make a note when I reorganize my data of what my dependent variable is. Right? So this little reminder here tells me that my y-axis is going to be percentage of intervals of wandering and my x-axis is going to be sessions. And so how I'm going to add that in Google Slides is by inserting a text box. And I'm just going to put it kind of anywhere. And I'm going to type the word session. Now I want to format this text box the way I want all my text boxes to look, and then I will copy and paste. So for example, the color of this text, you may or may not be able to tell on screen, but the color of this text is gray instead of black. I want it to be black, so I'm selecting these 3 dots to get the rest of my icon menu. And then mousing over the text color icon, selecting that, and I'm going to select black. The other thing I want to do is center align. So the next thing I want to do is center align this text box so that the text appears in the center of the box. And then I'm going to make this text a little bit bigger. I think if you can make it 32, that's great. But I'm just anticipating that percentage of intervals of wandering is kind of a long title for my y-axis. So instead of making it 32, I'm going to make it 24. And now what I'm going to do is kind of line up the edge of this text box with the y-axis, and then the other edge of the text box with the end of the x-axis. And what that's going to do is put the session axis label, x-axis label, right in the middle of the x-axis. Okay. So that's the x-axis label. Now to make the y-axis label, I'm just going to make a copy of the x-axis label. If your x-axis is not selected, you click on it to select it. You know it's selected if it's got a blue rectangle around it. And then I can Control C or edit copy, and Control V or edit paste. Now I'm just going to move it so that it's clearly out of the way. And now I want my y-axis label not to be session, but rather to be percentage of intervals with, or of, I think they used of wandering. And I'm using title case, and I'm not abbreviating percentage like this, although I don't know that it's the end of the world if you do that, but APA style doesn't like that. So I'm going to write out the word. But now if I move my x-axis to sort of, or my y-axis label to the center, that doesn't look very good. I don't want it overlapping my graph. So what I'm going to do, first thing I'm going to do is rotate it, and I can rotate it in the Arrange menu. There's a rotate option. I'm going to rotate it counterclockwise. Now, if you're in the text editor part, right, so you can see a blinking cursor where you can edit the text that's in your text box. It won't let you rotate. So if you go to Arrange, it will let you flip the label horizontally or vertically, but not rotate it counterclockwise for some reason. So you want to make sure you've selected the text box, but you're not editing the text. So you've got a blue square or rectangle around the text box and no blinking cursor, and then go to the Arrange menu and then rotate counterclockwise. And I'm going to move this away from the axis a little bit. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to zoom out just so that I can see both ends of the graph. And then I'm going to move the top of the graph, the top of the text box to about line up with the 100, and the bottom of the text box to about line up with the 0, and it needs to be on 2 lines there, but that's okay. And now that I've done that, I can move my y-axis label so that it's a little bit closer to the y-axis. And there we go. I have an x-axis and a y-axis. So the last thing I want to do is add some phase labels. So in order to add the phase labels, I'm going to copy and paste my x-axis label again because it's already got black text instead of gray text and it's already centered. I'm going to move it up to the top of the graph, and I'm going to resize it so that it's sort of the same size as the first phase. I'm also, I think it makes things a little bit clearer when the size of the font of the axis labels is a little bit bigger than the font size for the phase labels. That makes it really clear to the reader that, oh yeah, these are axis labels and these are phase labels, that they're kind of different categories of text if they're different sizes. So I'm going to make the phase labels just a little bit smaller, or enough smaller that it's clear that they are smaller. And I'm going to change that from session to baseline. Remember, I've got a baseline phase. And then I'm going to copy and paste that. I'm going to move this one over to the next phase. And I could call that a DRO, or I could call it treatment, or I could call it, in this case, tangible, because the reinforcer for ETA was a tangible reinforcer. In fact, it was snacks. So if I wanted to call it snacks, I could call that the snacks contingency condition. Let me go back to DRO. And then I don't need to change the text for this one. I just need to move it over. Another baseline, and then another DRO. And this one, I'm going to change the width of the box a little because this last phase is a little bit longer. But because it's a center aligned text box, the text is always going to be centered on the phase, no matter how long the phase is. Now, I've got one phase label that's kind of a little bit higher than all the others. That was originally where I wanted to have them, but I think I might actually like it better if they were all a little bit lower. That's a little bit more compact. It doesn't get in the way of the data. So yeah, I think that's what I'm going to do. So in order to do that, I'm going to select all 4 text boxes. I'm going to select the first one, then hold down the control key, select the second and the third and the fourth. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange them using the arrange text menu, then align, and I'm going to align them to the bottom. Okay, so now I have 2 axis labels, 3 phase lines, and 4 phase labels. And let's take a look at what's in the speaker notes for this. So create an ABA style graph showing percentage of intervals of wandering as a function of session. Check for your assigned resident and paste it on the slide. We've done that. Your graph should include these elements: clearly visible y-axis and x-axis with labels that are meaningful for the data that you show. Numbers on the axes are clearly visible with range appropriate for the data set. For sessions, we have 30 sessions, so the x-axis goes from 1 to 30. This is a percentage, and the values go from 0 to 100. What I'm looking for here with meaningful values for a y-axis scale, if you're dealing with a percentage, if you wanted to truncate it a little bit, so I think by default, Google Sheets cut this off at 80% because there were no sessions where the percentage of intervals of wandering was higher than about 75. But either going all the way from 0 to 100 or going from 0 to 80 would make sense for ETA's data. All right, the data points show data from the relevant sheet for your assigned resident. So you're not going to hand in a slide deck with a graph of ETA's data. You're going to graph your own residents. And then the phase lines are visible in the right spots on the graph and don't interfere with other elements of the graph, and vice versa. So there's a space between what happened in session 7 and what happened in session 8. There's no line connecting them, so my phase line doesn't cross any streams. And the same goes for all of my other phase lines. They're all kind of lined up with each other, and they're all as close as I could get to halfway between the last session of one phase and the first session of the next phase. Then phase labels are legible, consistent with the information on the datasheet for your assigned resident, and don't interfere with other elements of the graph. I might want to also specify, if I had a figure note, I would put this in the figure note. I can just put this down in the corner. that DRO is differential reinforcement of other behavior. I'm going to make this really small so that it all fits. And I kind of like that better. I know everything else is center aligned, but I like this better if it's left aligned. One last thing I'm going to show you in case you want to include it. You might notice in figure 1 for Hurd and Watson, they have text boxes that indicate the pseudonym of the resident whose data they're showing. And that's so that you can tell, okay, out of these 4 panels, which client was which. You can match up the text that they wrote in the results section with the figure that they're graphing. You don't need to do this because you only are presenting a single panel, but if you wanted to, you just insert a text box, put your client's name in the text box. If you're thinking about font sizes, if you've got 2 fonts sizes, I would go with sort of the smaller of the 2 and change the border color to black, just because that's how applied behavior analysts do it. So we finished our graph showing percentage of intervals of wandering as a function of sessions for ETA. We've done our calculations, and what we want to do next is interpret them. Right? On slide 4, I'm asking you to report the results of the DRO intervention for your resident. I'm going to do it for ETA. And I'm asking you in your response, you should report the percentage reduction in percentage of intervals with wandering when DRO was first introduced, whether wandering returned to baseline levels in the return to baseline, and the subsequent percentage reduction in percentage of intervals with wandering when DRO was reintroduced. So I am going to sort of take a page out of Hurd and Watson's book. So I'm going to look up here. So the first number I want is the first DRO phase compared to the first baseline phase. And what we found was a 69.6% reduction. So following, let's see, Bonnie's example, for example, because Bonnie also had tangible consequences. I'm going to say when tangible consequences were applied contingent on the absence of wandering. Percentage of intervals in which ETA wandered decreased by, and they've said about 80%, but I'm going to specify in Bonnie's case, but I'm going to be a little bit more specific, by 69.6%. So decreased by 69.6%. End of sentence. Then did wandering return to baseline levels? So we actually had a 2.4% increase in wandering relative to the initial baseline when we returned to baseline contingencies, when we re-implemented the baseline. I'm going to call that a return to baseline levels. If you wanted to call that a slight increase relative to the initial baseline, I wouldn't argue with you. If you called it an increase without the qualifier, I might think like it's not much of an increase like in my head, but you would be technically, pedantically correct. It is an increase in the mean percentage of intervals with wandering relative to the first baseline. What you don't want to write here is that it was a slight reduction, right? Because that's the wrong direction. So I'm going to say wandering returned to baseline levels when, and I'm going to add savory snacks. When snacks were contingent right? And that's just the return to baseline. They didn't have any programmed consequences. They determined that that was what was happening naturally. So when we returned to no programmed contingencies, then snacks were contingent on wandering. And when snacks were contingent on wandering, wandering returned to those initial baseline levels. And then finally, this does not have to be 3 separate sentences. If you want to write it as 2 sentences, if you want to revise it, use different words. Okay, then I'm going to say reapplication of snacks for the absence of wandering resulted in a, what was it this time? 69.9% reduction in wandering. Okay. So then the next slide, I'm asking you to report the conclusion you drew based on your results, right? So is this an effective treatment for wandering in this case? Well, from looking at the graph, what I see is a lot more wandering in the baseline phases than in the treatment phases. When I look at the numbers, I see about a 70% reduction in wandering. So that's not 100% effective, but I would say that a 70% reduction is pretty good. So I'm going to say that differential reinforcement of other behavior with tangible consequences, and I could even specify again savory snacks, was an effective treatment for ETA's wandering. Right, so single sentence. And like it says, if you were doing a true single subject experiment, then slides 4 and 5 together might make a nice little results section. So since we've written a results section in slide 6, I'm asking you to discuss some implications of these results. I'm going to leave that for you to do, right? You can think of this as kind of a 1 or 2 sentence discussion section. Right? You could talk about what was effective about this approach, if it was effective. Why was it effective or why was it not effective? What do you think could have been more effective, right? 70% reduction is pretty good, but why do you think it wasn't 100%, right? And then what could others learn from these data that we analyzed together? All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Good luck on your homework assignment.